Howdy folks. This is going to be a continuation of the previous lesson in how to use Mongo. So I've built a little bit on our existing application. Let's take a look at that. None of this changed. We went over this in the last video. I've added in these two where I'm using a body parser now because we're actually going to be building some APIs and a main router. So in our main router, we've just got our API router, which only has the user router, which just has some stub user methods. And so I've got a post that takes in username and password. I've got a get by ID, and then I've got a get all. So right now, if I run any of these in Postman, I get a 501. 501 means not implemented, which is very appropriate in this particular case because I haven't implemented the code. So let's take a look at that. Now, there's two things that we're going to cover today. We're going to cover adding data to Mongo, and we're going to cover fetching data out of Mongo. And there's a couple ways to do both. Before we do that, though, we need to do a little bit of a refactor. In this system here, we need to actually be able to access our database URL, but that is kind of trapped in here, right? So we need this to be available to the rest of our program, which we can't really do at this point. However, we do also want to have this app.listen so it only gets called once the connection finishes. So what we're going to do, we're going to make a config connection file. And then I'm going to take this whole client thing here. I'm going to put that into a function. I'm going to call it connect Mongo. All right. So we got our Mongo client. Let's go ahead and grab that as well. And our connection string. So actually we're going to need this here. And we're going to need our import. Okay, well that's all well and good, but now the app needs to be there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to export this, connect Mongo, but I'm going to have it take in a callback function. Then, once I'm finished connecting, instead of this app.listen, I'm just going to call the callback function. Now in server, I'm going to get rid of all this, and we're going to import connect Mongo. Require config connection, and then we're going to call connect Mongo, and that's going to be my callback. So now what'll happen is I have this connect Mongo function, which is somewhere else in the program, and I just know that as soon as it's done, I'm going to do my app listen. Now if I run this code, you see it does exactly the same thing. Server started. Totally fine. Okay, what that means is now I can actually have this database out here and set it at this point. What does that mean? Well, I can have another function now that just returns that database. Now, because of the way the modules are set up, I can import this module multiple times, and this code doesn't get overwritten. So now as soon as connect Mongo happens, this variable gets set, which I can use at other parts of my program by calling the getDB function. This is just something that you can do in Node. It's not particularly uncommon. You cannot call getDB, of course, until connect Mongo is called. But because the only place we're going to be calling that are inside of our APIs, and the APIs can't trigger until our app is set up anyway, we know for a fact that the API will never trigger and will never call getDB until this callback function succeeds. Because this callback function is what actually causes the server to start. Okay, so now we've got getDB. Let's take a look at our user API. getDB require config connection. So now we have our database. Note that we shouldn't call getDB immediately as soon as this file opens because it might not be set yet, but we'll call it inside each of the user routers. So, like that. We know at this point our database is valid. So, first thing we should do is look at how to post. Well, the first thing we need to do is decide what table we're posting to. We know because of the connection string that we're hitting the user DB. Maybe we could give that a better name. But the collection is going to be the equivalent of the table, right? So if I see db.collection users, that's the first thing we need to do, because it's kind of the equivalent of from, right? So in SQL, you'd say select X from or insert into table. That's what this does. This just sets the active table or collection. Now, you may remember when we set up Mongo initially, we don't have to create this database. If we just connect to it, Mongo will create it automatically. The same thing goes for collections. So in this case, I've got my users collection here. Mongo's just going to create that. Why is it able to do that? Well, think about the way that it's set up. In SQL, we need to know the schema ahead of time because it's a relational database. It is not flexible. It requires that schema, which means we need to have already told the database name, the tables, and all the schema so that it knows how to do inserts. Mongo doesn't have that limitation, and because it doesn't need to know schema, we can create collections and databases on the fly because it doesn't need to know anything about them except the name, which is kind of useful. All right, so now that we have our collection, the next thing we're going to call is an insert method, insert1. Now this takes a couple parameters. The first parameter is object to insert. The second one is callback function. All right, so the object, let's just put an object in here, username, password. This becomes important, like you probably don't want to actually just put your request.body in here. Why? Because it's nice to validate that these fields actually exist. If you just put your request.body in here, I mean, someone could call your API with really any data and just it gets inserted into your database, which you don't always want. And then because this is a callback based thing, error and results. So if there's an error, then we probably want to log that. So that error, cannot insert user. And then let's return 500 error in that case. Status 500.end. Otherwise, the result that we're actually given is going to be the new document. So that also includes the ID, which is valuable to send. So let's just send that. And it will be a JSON result. So there we go. That's how we insert data into Mongo. There's also an insert many function, in which case this becomes an array of objects rather than one object. But otherwise, it's completely the same. Let's try it out. Okay, we start it up. And we go here, create user. And we get 200 OK. Acknowledge true, inserted ID. Now you notice it didn't actually return the document, it just returned some data. Totally fine. There's our ID. Let's put another user in there. Okay. Cool. Seems like that's working. If we want, we can always go to Compass as well, just to verify. But instead, we could actually implement our get route. So this is going to be the get all. So this gets every single user in the collection. And the way we do that, so similarly, we don't have any parameters here. db equals get db to get our database. db.collection, just like before, users. Did I call it users? Yes, I did. Dot find. Okay. Now this is a little different. Find can take a list of parameters of basically the equivalent of the where clause. These are the way that it filters and determines what kind of how to sort or filter down the results. We don't actually want to filter it right now. We just want to get the whole thing. So we're going to say find, and then if we get that out, that's not going to give us exactly what we want. We have to tell it how we want that data, right? Because Mongo is not going to immediately make this query happen. It uses the builder syntax. So we can put in a bunch of different things like limit and all that stuff after the find. And it kind of builds that query up for us. In order to finish that, we have to call toArray. And that again has a callback. This is actually going to be results. Results is going to be a JSON array containing JSON objects. Well, I'm actually just going to grab this code from here because it's going to look pretty much the same. Cannot get users or JSON results. So similar idea. Find toArray. toArray has a callback in it. This callback is called when the query is finished. If there's an error, we log that error and send a 500. Otherwise, we send the JSON results. So let's take a look at that. And if I go to get all users, you can see API user, there's no parameters. We got a 501 not implemented. Did I not? Oh, you know why? I think because this actually needs to go after, maybe. Oh, no. It's because this 501 is still in here. I'm already handling it here. I need to get rid of this. That is why. You can see it even gave me an error, headers sent already. It sent the original headers and then it tried to send new ones. Yeah, Express doesn't like when you do that. All right. And there we go. There's our 3 users. You can see the document ID, the username, and the password. We probably want to filter out the password for actually sending it up because sending encrypted or unencrypted passwords is dangerous. But that's okay for now. So that is 2 of these. So let's grab this ID just so I can put it in here for that third API. Since this third API is going to actually take in an ID. If I run this again, still not implemented. So now let's see. Here's this last one. We have the ID, and we want to specifically find a user with an ID. Well, what we could do is, well, first let's get our DB. db.collection users.find. We could actually put in ID like this. Because remember, this is the field that Mongo is using, right? We got that from here, that underscore ID field. And then the value is here, and then toArray, results, and then we could put something actually very similar in here. Okay, cannot get user, and then we return our user. So let's try that. Started, get user. Uh-oh, it crashed. What has happened? Oh, I misspelled toArray. Very reasonable that that would not work. All right, let's try that again. Oh, and the same problem. I forgot to delete the 501. You'd think after the first time I would remember it, but I did not. All right, and there we go. Oh, look at that. We got an empty message. I wonder if I'm not getting the ID appropriately. That's probably what it is. Okay, so the issue here, what's happening is that the ID is actually an invalid format. Let's take a look at what the data actually looks like, and I'll show you what I mean. So in Compass, we've got our database and our table, and you notice Mongo has an object ID. This is not actually a string. So the value of the Mongo ID, document ID, is not a string. It's an object ID that represents that string. What that means is that when we're doing a search via the Mongo system, we can't just search for the ID as a string like this. Instead, we actually have to wrap it. So we can import object ID from MongoDB. And then if we wrap this, so object ID, then what we're actually going to do is we're actually going to be searching for the object ID rather than the ID as a string. So now if we go in here, you can see that shows up. Now here's the other thing though. We requested this single object, but it came back as an array. Why is that? Well, that's because we're calling find and toArray. That's kind of how it works. Instead of find, there is also a findOne that we can use to make this happen. Now, findOne is a little bit different in the way it works. So first of all, we're going to say findOne, and that's going to find a single object. It does not have a toArray. So we're going to take this and put it down here. Instead, it also has a callback. So similar to how the insert one works, this also has its own callback. I'm just going to grab this code, since otherwise it's pretty much the same, and get rid of that. So difference between find and findOne. Find has the toArray that you have to call. findOne has the callback. So we'll start that up. Go here, get user. And now we see we get that single object. And if it couldn't be found, then we would get a null back instead. So here's an interesting thing to bear in mind here. We've got our ObjectId here, right? Let's say we tried to make it slightly longer, an invalid ID. Well, now we get a server crash. And the server crashed saying, argument passed in must be a string of 12 bytes or a string of 24 hex characters or an integer. That's talking about ObjectId here. That didn't even get to the database. It does not like an ID that's longer, that's a string that's too long. So you may need to handle, do some try-catch handling here to make sure that you're doing ID validation if you are searching this way with Mongo. Anyway, that is going to be it for now. That was insertion and fetch or find. Next time we'll cover update and delete. Thanks, and I'll see you all in class.